Did you see the brat dance yesterday? Charlie X.
Okay, I don't know what brat is. What is brat?
Explain what brat.
I know that this has been
so
ever
when
since
Kamala Harris
Kamala,
announced her candidacy, this is Charlie X, and she's a very popular singer, I guess, among the Gen Z and post millennials. Anyway, so she has this song, and brat is like new slang, something really cool is so brat.
Like a good thing.
Yeah, it's so brat. So we did with USA, we did a brat dance, and we have 17,000 views or more now. you could actually see exactly how many views you have today. Oh, that's not it. Okay, here we go. I learned it in 5
Learned
seconds.
the dance?
So, yeah. Okay,
I guarantee you could give
our
me a
brat,
week. I couldn't.
19,800 views as of this morning, just over 24 hours.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's incredible. So
let's start with this. You are a very unique president of a university. You are at all of the sporting events. You root everybody on. You've dyed your hair green. You're doing the brat dance. You've got, you got the pom poms. You've got all of these. Yeah, keep that right there. What about your leadership style has you do all of this? I don't think I asked it the right way, but tell us about your leadership style.
So when I was interviewed for the job to be president of Utah Valley University, there was one part of that whole interview process where I had to meet with any and all members of the community who wanted to come. And they could ask me any question they wanted. And one of the questions was, what is your leadership style?
Mm-hmm.
And literally, I hadn't really prepared an answer, that X is my leadership style. But funny enough, in 1 second, I said the dancing queen style. And what came to my mind was when I was working in Singapore and I was the vice dean of research at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I worked also in executive education. We would have these very intense weeks when leaders were at the school, we were educating them. And my team and I, and they were young people, we'd work till, 1 a.m. like for so many nights. And then on the last day, I would take them clubbing. That's why I thought I was the dancing queen. And so when you say I show up for everything, I think it's easy enough for a leader to lock your door and be in your little private Idaho. But I think in this day and age, especially when you're leading students, you've got to be with them. So this is the first week of school. Last night at Wolverine Fest, we had live bands, food trucks, and all those inflatables. I actually did quite a few of the inflatable stuff. I like the jump and duck because something's going to hit you. It's just turning. So it's almost like the playful side also of leadership, that we work hard and we are strategic, but we don't lose our inner child that knows how to play.
What does it mean to be a Wolverine?
Oh, I love the question. What does it mean to be a Wolverine? To be a Wolverine means that you live the 3 core values of Utah Valley University. The first is exceptional care. You're going to care about yourself and others. You're going to see yourself and see others. Second is exceptional accountability. You're going to be accountable for your time, your resources. You bring your best self to work every day. And the third is exceptional results. Nobody has a monopoly on ambition. And when I arrived here and people said, just UVU, I've been in very elite institutions, Harvard, MIT, Columbia University, where I was a visiting scholar, Hong Kong University, and the National University of Singapore, which is ranked number 1 in Asia. And I know what that kind of snobbery means. And so to me, that is not very interesting. What is interesting is what we do daily, because nobody has a monopoly on dreams and ambitions. And we have a lot of dreams and ambitions as Wolverines.
What were your dreams and ambitions growing up?
Oh, growing up, I just talked about this to students yesterday because this semester I am mentoring 100 freshmen and sophomores in a program.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, in a program called Presidential 100. No credit, no exams. We're going to meet 7 times during the academic year. And they actually also asked that question, what were your dreams and ambitions? Because I grew up so poor, my father made less than $50 a month and had 7 children to support. My earliest dreams are very simple. This is what I told the students. One of my earliest dreams was to be rich enough someday that I could drink as much Coca-Cola as I wanted. And
That's
also
a
that,
great dream.
and so that also that I could eat as much chippies. Those are chips, local chips in the Philippines. And honestly, between the ages of 0 to 14, I never ever had cash to buy Coca-Cola for myself or chippies. I never did. And so my early dreams were very simple. As I got educated and as I learned about the world, they became bigger dreams. So as a kid, I read about New York City and I said, I want to live in New York City. So you just begin to imagine fantastic stuff. So I began having fantastic dreams, like going to New York City, working for the United Nations, traveling the world. So those were some of my dreams when I was young.
When did you leave the Philippines?
I left the Philippines when I was 18
Okay.
and arrived here in Provo, Utah at the tender age of 18.
How does that happen? How do you end up in Provo, Utah?
So I was born and raised very strictly a Catholic. Catholic nuns educated me. When I was 10 years old, I joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so from that vantage point, Utah became Mecca. Utah is Mecca. As a faithful Latter-day Saint, it was my dream just to be in Zion and especially to go to Brigham Young University. And I already had a scholarship to the University of the Philippines when I was 15. So I went to the University of the Philippines for about 3 semesters. But I applied to BYU, got in probably when I was 17, but it took more than a year to get an American visa because I was a single young woman with no assets. And the U.S. Embassy turned me down 3 times. 3 times. Every time I'd go get a visa, the consul would say, "Where's your bank account?" None. "Do you own land?" No. "Do you have a vehicle?" No. And they're like, "You are a flight risk." That's what every consul said to me. "You are a flight risk. We can't give you a visa." So after the 3rd try, I had friends in the Philippines who were Mexican American and they were well established, and they went to the embassy on my behalf and said, "You have to let this young woman go and get her education." So that's how I arrived in Utah in November of 1982.
Did you know anyone here?
I had 2 sisters here.
Oh, okay.
So my sisters had married Americans. One actually married the missionary who baptized her, and they wrote for 6 years. And then after 6 years, they got married. So I had 2 sisters here, and I lived with my sister in Orem. She and my brother-in-law were very generous. And I remember going to BYU. I had to wait for a ride every single day. I had no car. There were no buses at the time. I'd be sitting in the Wilkinson Center. Either my brother-in-law would give me a ride, or sometimes I just ask people, "Hey, could you give me a ride to Orem?"
That's incredible. What did you study at BYU?
I had 2 majors. I studied Russian literature and international relations. So I was both in the Germanic and Slavic languages department and in the political science department.
What about Russian literature excited you?
Yeah, great question. So when I was a 15, 16-year-old student at the University of the Philippines, I was very, very worried about nuclear war. The little that I knew as a teenager gave me so much anxiety. And the Philippines was a strong ally of the United States, and I wanted to study our enemy, which was the Soviet Union. And there were really no courses at the top public university of the Philippines. However, I met a professor who was in his 70s and I think he was a communist and had lived in Moscow for 11 years. So I started taking Russian classes. And I learned early on that the politics and history of Russia and the Soviet Union could not be divorced from the arts, from the writers, the poets. So that's what got me into Russian literature. And I was a great reader anyway as a child. I really loved reading. I was the kind of kid who 6 hours could go by and I wouldn't know that if I was buried in a book. I could skip meals if I was reading a really good book. And I really loved Russian literature.
Oh, they have the best writers.
Yeah, there's so much depth in it. And, and then I got some great mentors, especially in Russian literature. My professor, Gary Browning, who I'm friends with to this day. So that's how I got into Russian literature and the study of War and Peace. And War and Peace is Tolstoy's great novel. You've got to link that with the history of the Russian people
Yeah.
and their literature.
And so was the idea like, hey, I want to work in international relations. I want to work for the UN. Like was there a goal, or was it just like, I'm interested in these two things?
There was no goal career-wise.
That's
because
when I was going to UVU, I was doing the same thing. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing.
I did not know what I was doing. I just knew that literature spoke to me. I felt alive when I was reading. And also these big issues of war and peace and why people would kill each other. Why would people die for something or kill for something? I was just fascinated. And I think I'm very grateful in hindsight that I allowed myself as a young person, even though I grew up poor, I did not obsess about money. I obsessed about ideas. And that's what that education at BYU gave me, was the luxury to obsess about ideas. And I figured I'll get a job, when it came time, I'll get a job. And I was working as well as a student the whole time I worked.
Where did you work?
I was the research assistant for Gary Browning. And then I became the student assistant for the faculty forum, which was the faculty forum that decided who would come to BYU as forum speakers, who were not general authorities of the church. So external scholars, poets, scientists. That's what I did. And it was a very high-paying job.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It was better than cleaning the toilets at 4 a.m.
So you graduate from BYU, right?
Yes.
And then what do you do next?
Then I applied for graduate school. I figured I wasn't really done with Russia. So I applied to Yale, Georgetown, and Harvard. And I got into all three, but Harvard gave me the most money. So I took Harvard because it essentially was a free ride. And Harvard, to this day has a famous Russian research center. And I went and got my master's degree there.
And so what do you do after that, after Harvard?
Well, I needed more education. So I still wasn't done because I loved studying. And so I applied for a PhD and I went to MIT. MIT at the time, and probably still today, is one of the best international relations department. And I was very interested in defense and arms control. I have a minor in defense and arms control from MIT. And MIT had physicists and chemists, very famous names like George Rathjens, people who were involved in the Manhattan Project, who were scientists but also taught policy and political science. And so I went to MIT, really an amazing institution. And if you're to think about even theoretical schools of international relations, really one of the very best in the country. So I did my PhD studies there. After 2 years, I did my general exams, passed those, and then I decided that the Soviet Union, my subject matter, I thought it was gonna implode, and so I thought instead of writing a dissertation, I should just go there and work. So Harvard employed me to be a director of the Harvard Project on Strengthening Democratic Institutions in Moscow. I began as an assistant director and then later took over the gentleman who was running it in Moscow.
What year was this?
This was 1990 to 92. And prior to that, I'd already been to the Soviet Union 3 times. And then I lived there. I did a couple of stints to do research and then a really solid almost 18 months.
And what year did it collapse?
It collapsed in 1991.
Yeah. So
I was there when the evening Gorbachev walks out of the Kremlin. Really quite a moment in history. And the newspapers the next day had a picture of him, walking out of the Kremlin after he'd said, he was stepping down. There's no more Soviet Union. It was quite a dramatic moment. And it was like a coup, There were 4 other Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Those 3 presidents decided that they would be independent. And the only way you could have kept it together was to have a civil war.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev, I met with him 4 times. I would describe him as a very civilized humanist, and people resent him for losing imperial power. But I think he's given us an example of, peaceful transition. Obviously, today with the war in Ukraine, it's not very peaceful at all. And the roots of this war probably date back to the implosion of the Soviet Union. Yeah, so I was there. I was also there during the bombing of the Russian White House,
Oh,
if you
wow.
remember that. And I actually ended up, it was funny. I was walking on the ring road in Moscow, and I see Ambassador Thomas Pickering, the U.S. ambassador, and he's not in a suit.
Famous ambassador.
He's not in a suit and tie. I'm like, Ambassador Pickering, why are you running? And he said, oh, there's like a little battle here at the Russian White House. And a lot of people died that day and the next day. And I ended up doing some reporting for NPR, for National Public Radio. My friend Mike Schuster was the NPR correspondent. He just said, just come with me. And we went to hospitals interviewing those who were wounded. So I was there. It was a very unique experience in the sense that I had a front seat to one of the largest imperial implosions in the world, and really the rather tragic end of a socioeconomic political system. And most people in the West do not realize how deep a tragedy that was, how hard that was for people in the Soviet Union. And a lot of people, died from the stress. Alcoholism became even worse. It was already a bad problem. And the mortality age for Russian men became 50, 52 years old. They were just dying. It was a terrible time.
What would be a comparable? It's like if we lost California.
If you lost all 50 states, basically, if instead of the United States of America,
there were 50 presidents.
There were 50, suddenly overnight, you have 50 independent countries. And to visit your mom in Iowa, you're going to need a visa. And also the dollar collapses, and your life savings of $1 million suddenly is only worth 10,000. That's the equivalent. And so it's really, really tragic. There is a book by Svetlana Alexievich. I don't know if your listeners would be interested. She's won the Nobel Prize in Literature, but everything she writes is from oral interviews. So Secondhand Time is the title of the book. And I would strongly recommend that for anyone wanting to understand the human cost of the disintegration of the Soviet Union.
And we're still feeling the effects of that, right?
Yeah.
And then you got like the 2014, the government in Ukraine gets changed, probably,
Yes.
With some help from us.
Georgia, Moldova,
Yeah.
you're feeling all of that. Belarus, which of course is very much in the Russian sphere of influence. So, empires, generally speaking, do not implode peacefully. If you think of the French Empire, the British Empire, or the American Empire for that matter. I'm from the Philippines, and we were a big chunk of that American Empire at the turn of the century when the U.S. decided it would become an imperial power. And certainly that was not at all peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Filipinos were killed, and then you had the Japanese coming in, occupying us, and then the Americans coming back, and then the destruction of all of Manila. That's why there are hardly any historical buildings in Manila from the 300 years of Spanish rule. All of that was just bombed to smithereens or burnt, during World War II.
What did you learn during your time in Russia?
What did I learn during my time in Russia? Oh, many, many, many things. So personally, one of the lessons that I learned in Russia, because I was then representing Harvard in a big ambitious project, and I was in my 20s. And one of my comparative advantages was that I spoke Russian well. And so one of the things I learned was, as a young woman, how to lead, how to command attention. I mean, I hated it because they were all like asking me to make coffee, and it's a very sexist society.
Mm.
And a lot of the work that I was doing, I would be mainly with men, Russian men. And so I learned one of the biggest lessons was how to occupy space as a tiny woman of color. Walk into a room and know you have 5 minutes to command that room. Make them listen to you. So I would prepare, So one of the things, just personal leadership. So many important lessons, how to manage people, how to get things done. And then I think from a different perspective, maybe from a political science and policy perspective, one of my biggest lessons was be humble. We went in there as Americans, and frankly, the Russians and other, post-Soviet citizens were hungry for knowledge and learning on everything, from how to organize your police, how to do elections, how to privatize all the state assets. They were so hungry for that learning. But I think at the end of the day, we disappointed them because that kind of experiment, socio-political and economic change, take time.
Mm-hmm.
They take generations. And we had the hubris to pretend we had all the answers, and we didn't. To me, it was almost tragically laughable towards the end, looking at all this advice we were giving them. And there isn't a one-to-one equivalency when you try to change a country and its economic and political system. And I'll go back again to my country, the Philippines. We have been trying to look like America for eons now. We have a political system that's patterned like the US with 3 branches of government, checks and balances. It doesn't work like that at all. It works like the politics of the Philippines from 400 years ago. Very tribal, very provincial. Your different languages, very patronage oriented. Who's your patron? It doesn't matter that you have on the surface the same structure. So that's another lesson, is when you're advising other countries and people, stay really, really humble. A lot of this change, as a person working in Russia, I could fly in and out. And if things got really bad, I simply flew out and went back to New York. But now you're leaving these people with problems.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was tough. And you see the backlash with, Putin being the president after Yeltsin. So personal lesson, kind of a socioeconomic political lesson, just be really humble. And what else did I learn? Third, I learned a lot about human resilience. I mean, just think about it. Overnight, like all food disappears.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Producers were hoarding food. They were waiting for prices to be liberated. My friends were lining up 6 hours to get a kilo or 2 of sugar, and they had babies. It was just huge. Like I had to learn, wow, respect Russian resilience. How these people were dealing with unbelievably difficult things being thrown at them, happening to them, and they had no control. And yet they had to live every single day, So
I know.
yeah, so a lot of lessons.
What did you think when Putin took power after Yeltsin? What was your impression of him? Your initial impression?
Actually, I didn't know him at all.
Oh, interesting.
Putin was already the prime minister for a brief period of time when Yeltsin said this was my successor in 2000. But he had kind of, I guess, caught the attention of some people when he was working in the government of St. Petersburg under Tuminez. Tuminez was the name of the head of the St. Petersburg government. And so I really didn't know very much. And in fact, I had already finished my manuscript for my book, Russian Nationalism since 1856. And I had to add, an epilogue at the end. And I had to write it in a hurry. And now that I read it, it's really poorly written. But I did say in that epilogue that, I pointed out the war in Chechnya, how he prosecuted it in the most brutal manner, in the most unspeakably brutal manner. And he dehumanized the Chechens, so much, and would kind of make an example of people he had disfigured or the army had disfigured. And then so I wrote in the epilogue that if these things were a sign of things to come, that we might see a different, maybe a more malevolent version of nationalism, and how Russia would behave toward its neighbors. Of course, that was not an inevitable outcome, because the early rhetoric of Vladimir Putin was actually pro-West, pro international norms. Yeah. And I think NATO expansion definitely was a big part of that process of being humiliated so much. So they lost a ton of territory. Their borders, went back to, the 1700s. And so it's very hard for countries that think of themselves as great states to suddenly just say, oh, we're small now. And And so those are my early impressions. And of course, the KGB background was certainly very interesting as well. And I think where you kind of built your career, where you cut your teeth as a young professional, all of those habits and ways of thinking and working are the things that you go back to when you are in higher leadership positions. So it really matters what the life background and life experiences of leaders are. It matters so much. It will inform how they lead.
Do you think NATO made a mistake to continue to encroach on the border?
I was a proponent just after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. I was a proponent of actually including Russia. And of course, everybody said no, that will destroy NATO and the characteristics of what makes NATO NATO. But at the time, the Russians, I was in many of these conversations through the Aspen Institute and other fora where U.S., Eastern European, Russian, policy and political leaders would get together. And I was in enough of these meetings where the Russians would say, give us a chance. It doesn't matter if it takes 20 years. Give us a chance to be part of NATO or the European community. And the answer uniformly was no way. And then the old Warsaw Pact, of course, practically all became members of NATO. So I do think it's a factor in that, the humiliation of a great state power, it sort of comes back to bite you in a way.
We'd be living in a completely different world if they were part of NATO, when you said.
And not even really part necessarily to have to be officially part of NATO, because I understand the size of Russia makes it difficult to have the same military or political norms. But I think under Clinton, we had something called the Partnership for Peace, where there was enough dialogue, joint military exercise. And it's been such a long time now since I've looked at this topic. So I'm probably very outdated. But I think in Russian history, because the book that I wrote was very much history, even though I am a political scientist. So it's 150 years. I go back to the Crimean War of 1856. And I think Russia has always had this battle of either joining the West or not. Because if you look at the expanse of the Russian Empire, it goes all the way from like Japan, the Sakhalin, to all the way to close to Europe when you think of Ukraine or parts of Poland, which were part of the Russian Empire, or Moldova. And so it's always had this kind of identity crisis, and it's very well documented in Russian thought, whether, you are purely Slavic Russian with a special Russian spirit, or are you part of Europe? So there's a strand of thought in Russia called the Westernizers. And I think Russia has never been able to bridge those two, right? And I think over time, if you were to integrate a country like Russia into Western norms, it takes a very long time because it takes internal change of mindset. Yeah, so that just hasn't happened.
It's just a whole different culture.
Yeah.
At what point do you get to Microsoft? How do you get to Microsoft?
Oh, how do I get to Microsoft? In my family lived in Hong Kong from 2005 to 2008. And in 2008, we moved to Singapore because my husband was offered a job there with a hedge fund. And remember, this was the financial crisis when nearly the whole world, spiraled down to hell almost. Anyway, at the time, I was actually interviewing with Google for a job. And it was 6 months of interviewing. I couldn't believe it. Like, wow, it's that slow. Like they're having people in Australia interview me. I actually went to their campus in Mountain View, and I had an interview lined up with Sheryl Sandberg. And I arrived there, and they tell me, oh, yesterday she just took a job with Facebook. So it's almost the short answer is I went to Microsoft through Google. So eventually Google makes me a job offer. I was already in Singapore. And I forced them to it because I said, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy has made me a job offer. So you have to make up your minds. And they asked to see my job offer. They didn't trust me.
You're kidding.
And I thought, wow, that is so insulting and so arrogant. And during that time, Microsoft heard about me. They heard about this woman that Google's trying to recruit. So Microsoft started talking to me. They said, before you accept an offer there, talk to us first. So I talked to them, but after all was said and done, I decided not to join either company. I decided to go to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy because I had been at the Harvard Kennedy School and I was intrigued by a policy school
Yeah.
in Asia. So I joined the Lee Kuan Yew School. I worked there for 4 years in executive education and then as the founding vice dean of research. And then after 4 years, I got tired of academia and I thought, I should probably just go back to the corporate world. So I just phoned Microsoft. And really, to this day, I am so grateful. I mean, kudos to them. It was like, okay, you're interested, let's talk. And I was one of 3 Microsoft executives in the world who were running corporate, external, and legal affairs and was not a lawyer. The other 2 were in Russia and in China, and then me in Southeast Asia. And I oversaw government affairs, legal affairs, and philanthropy for 15 countries in Southeast and South Asia. So big ones like Bangladesh, small ones like Singapore, small but gigantic in business, over $1 billion in revenue. So that's how I came to Microsoft.
Yeah. Why is Singapore so special? It really feels like a special place.
It is a special place, and that's the reason why my family ended up living there for 10 years. When we first moved there, we thought, okay, maybe 3 years max, we'll return to the US. But honestly, we felt like we were living in paradise. So it's very difficult to leave paradise. It's a very, very expensive paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just there last summer, the nice apartments are 40,000 Singapore dollars a month, like 30,000 US dollars a month. So it's very,
That's
very
crazy.
expensive. And the American school, again, you'll be spending 45,000 per kid. So it's super expensive. But what is so special about it, I guess, if I were to summarize it, Singapore is a public policy laboratory. When they were forced to be independent, Malaysia forced them to be independent. I think it was 1968. They were very poor. They had slums. They had, I think their per capita in GDP was between $500 and $600. And today that's probably $65,000 GDP per capita, which is higher than the United States. So it's a public policy laboratory, what I would call kind of a relatively benign authoritarian government under Lee Kuan Yew. So he became prime minister for a very, very long time and was able to implement change because there's no change in government. And he had a big vision to make Singapore a tiny island nation. That land area is like the size of LA. It is just remarkable for that size and about 6 million people today. Let's say compared to Indonesia, and I can't remember the exact population of Indonesia, maybe 260 million. And the GDP of Singapore is just gigantic. It's such a well-run country. So they did everything from housing, infrastructure, education, clean water, affordable health care, all the things that we talk about in the United States, but we are not as effective. And of course, by the way, I should mention, because people always say, well, why? They're a dictatorship. So I say, the difference is a very professional civil service in Singapore. They take public policy very seriously. Yes, they have a dark side, but they're also quite responsive when the population is not happy. And they don't randomly shoot people like other dictatorships. I lived under Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, who killed thousands of people. Lee Kuan Yew's government would sue, but they did not kill people. And frankly, they deliver. And so their definition of democracy, they have regular elections. Their campaign period, I think, is 10 days. Just think about that.
Wow.
You're not going to waste your time campaigning. You campaign and there are opposition seats in parliament. So I think they had a clear vision that they were not going to be embarrassed as a country. They were going to have a rich and peaceful and prosperous country, but they were going to do it this way. If the West criticized them, they did not care.
Yeah.
That's I think pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's kind of, if you can not care about what the West says, you can get a lot done.
Yeah. What they need to do, where they need to improve, is more risk-taking, more of the arts, that kind of thing, because it's so engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and also I think being brave enough to allow more voices, more opposition, because they're still quite strong in not allowing, in that policy of not allowing too much opposition. But when you're rich and healthy, maybe at that
Yeah.
point you can say, okay, we can handle debate and opposition.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so at what point did you hear about the opportunity at UVU? Matt Holland was leaving.
Mm-hmm.
At what point you're like, I want to do that?
Yeah, I never really thought that I wanted to do that.
Really?
And I never thought I wanted to be a university president. And my friend Kent Christensen, who's an adjunct professor of art and design at UVU, was visiting me, and we went to Bali with my family, and he just kind of casually suggested it. And I was dismissive. But then eventually, because the thought kept, it was in my mind and didn't leave my mind. And so I want to listen to that thought in my head. And so I just looked up the university online, and I was blown away. I thought, how exciting is this? Such a big university. They admit everybody, which is counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what could you do with that in a day and age when we have a lot of inequality, we have a lot of injustice? How do you empower people with education so that they themselves can navigate their lives, their careers, their families? So I just became intrigued by that. And I thought, what else do I do with my career? After you've done so many things, you're like, okay, either I just retire now and I don't know, or watch movies, write some books, whatever I wanted to do. And I was intrigued enough by it, and didn't think that actually the search committee would get me, because here's a woman with 10 years in the corporate world, had never been a department chair or a provost. So I did not build a career inside an academic institution. Although I had a PhD, I've published in peer-reviewed journals, I've published a book, I've worked in university settings. So I think the members of the search committee who got me right away were those from the corporate world. They thought how intriguing that she's got the corporate experience, but also has a PhD and has worked in academia and has published. So yeah, so it was an unusual path, and something that surprised me. But I think it's been a rule of my career that I have never hesitated when I'm curious about something. I've never hesitated to say, hey, can I work in that field, even though I know nothing about it or I don't know very much about it. And it has been a very fulfilling journey. It has been a very meaningful journey with over 43,000 students that we serve.
Largest university in the state, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this fall, our enrollment is up 4%. And which is amazing, by the way, because in the country, in the last decade, we have lost 1.5 million students. And they're so it's just crazy. Across the country, actually, I think it's a 4% loss in enrollment. But UVU is doing the opposite. So it means that our community is just getting us more and more, that we want to support the students' dreams. We are not about snobbery. We can help you whether your ambition is a 9-month certificate or a 2-year associate's or a bachelor's or master's degree. And if you are the best and you work really hard, we can send you to Harvard, MIT, Cambridge, and Oxford, because we do that.
Yeah, which is incredible. UVU is such a special place. But what is the future of education? You're seeing this even more and more now. Clayton Christensen said that universities are all going to die if they don't adapt. And this was, 10-15 years ago.
Yeah.
And he was pretty prescient in some of the things that he wrote about that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
So I don't think that all universities are going to die. I think certainly the liberal arts colleges, whether you or the big research institutions like Harvard, MIT, California, Caltech, they'll always be around. They have a very important purpose, and they have the resources. They have massive endowments. Then you have small liberal arts colleges. So I just found out this week there's a college in Salisbury, North Carolina called Catawba. I don't know how to pronounce it. In the last 3 years, they've gotten two $200 million anonymous donations and one $42 million. So that's $442 million since 2022. So they will live forever. They have a $500,000 endowment per student. And they're liberal arts. They're all about sustainability. So there will definitely be institutions that will survive. However, we have already seen in the last 10 years A lot of campuses have closed. A lot of other universities have merged. Smaller ones have merged with larger ones. You have Northwestern, I think, is the one that bought Mills College in Silicon Valley for very little, but they promised to keep it as a going concern. And the real estate alone, the assets of Mills College was worth $1 billion. So it's already happening. And it is true, higher education is not exempt from the same dynamics of any industry that's being disrupted. And I've always said this at UVU, whether we like it or not, we are a business. At the same time, we are not a business because our bottom line is not just profitability. So it is natural when you're being disrupted, and if you're not ahead of these disruptions, you don't survive. So I think there will be more failures, but there are also new models of credentialing, including edX, Coursera, the large platforms that are aggregating degrees and non-degree skills based. So there's a lot of that. And I think for UVU, one of the things that we need to do more of is non-academic credentialing, whether that's purely skills-based education or continuing education in the professions or executive education. So it's a difficult time. And I think I'll just mention one more thing worth mentioning that really to me is discomforting, and that is the attacks on higher education.
Yeah.
That people would rejoice because all these presidents have resigned. Frankly, the job is very, very difficult. We are asked to do impossible things, and everybody is our constituent. The individual, the students, the faculty, the staff, the families, the legislature, the governor, the media. I don't think there is like one person who could possibly please everybody. And so, I mean, to all the listeners of this podcast, I have to ask for understanding and support, because if you're not supporting higher education, and you have to ask, why should you support it? Because we produce the workforce and we educate so people know how to think, they know how to reason, they know how to recover from failure and can overcome their trials in life, because certainly life is going to whack you in the face many times in your lifetime. And I think a university is a great place to get to know others who are not like you, and but be armed with the tools so you can live a productive, meaningful, and happy life.
I can't think of a better way to end than on that. That was incredible. Thank you so much for coming on here.
Thank you, Clint, and more power to Silicon Slopes.